Seattle's autumn rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ethan Walker's penthouse office, blurring the city lights into a wash of muted grays and silvers. The 38-year-old tech billionaire sat at his mahogany desk, staring across the room at his daughter. Lila Walker, just 8 years old, sat curled up in an oversized leather chair, her small frame swallowed by its vastness. Her pale fingers traced invisible patterns on her tablet screen, though Ethan knew she wasn't seeing anything. Her dark brown hair, the same shade as her late mother's, fell over her face like a curtain hiding her expression. It had been 6 months since Rebecca, Ethan's wife, and Lila's mother was killed in a car accident. 6 long months since that knock on the door, the police officer standing there, hat in hand, eyes heavy with sympathy. A drunk driver had run a red light. The impact killed Rebecca instantly. From that night forward, their world fell into silence. Lila hadn't spoken a single word since, the weight of helplessness. Ethan leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples, his jaw tight. His carefully pressed suit and spotless office couldn't disguise the exhaustion etched into his face. 3 therapists had tried working with Lila. 3 specialists in childhood trauma. And all 3 had left his penthouse looking defeated. The latest, Dr. Patricia Morgan, a respected child psychologist, had left barely an hour ago. Her parting words replayed in his mind. Mr. Walker, Lila shows no signs of trauma-induced mutism recovery. Physically, she can speak, but she's choosing not to. Without her participation, there's only so much therapy can do. Ethan stood silent in the doorway, watching another expert pack their carefully laminated handouts and leave. He'd written checks with more zeros than he cared to admit, called in favors from some of the best doctors in the country, and even flown specialists to Seattle. But his money, the empire he had built from scratch, couldn't buy the one thing that mattered: his daughter's voice. Rebecca had always been the heart of their little family. She was warm, spontaneous, and endlessly patient. When she died, it felt like the light had gone out of their world, and Ethan didn't know how to turn it back on. The broken father. Lila, sweetheart, Ethan said softly, his voice catching. The girl didn't look up. She hadn't for weeks. Her hazel eyes stayed fixed on the lifeless tablet screen, a world of noise and color she refused to enter. He knelt beside her chair, the stiff joints of his 6'1" frame creaking with the movement. He hesitated, afraid to push her too hard, but desperate to connect. Would you like to have lunch with Daddy today? Maybe we can go somewhere new." Silence. Her only response was a slow blink. Ethan's chest ached. 6 months ago, she had been a completely different child. Lively, curious, always talking, always laughing. She used to tell him about the shapes of clouds and how she thought cookies tasted better on rainy days. But now, it was like she had retreated somewhere far away where he couldn't follow. His hand hovered near hers, wanting to comfort her, but he stopped himself. Every failed attempt at conversation had taught him the same painful lesson. Forcing closeness only pushed her further away. Choosing what matters. The sharp buzz of his office intercom startled him. Mr. Walker, came Jennifer's voice, his 30-year-old assistant. "You have the quarterly board meeting in 10 minutes. Ethan stared at the blinking light on the console, his pulse heavy in his ears. A year ago, he would never have missed a meeting. Now he didn't hesitate. "Cancel it." Jennifer paused, confused. "Sir, the quarterly?" I said. "Cancel everything for the rest of the week." Ethan cut her off, his tone firm but calm. "My daughter needs me more than the company does." A soft gasp on the other end, followed by a quiet, "Understood, sir." He exhaled slowly and turned back to Lila. She was still tracing patterns on the leather chair. Rebecca's ghost. She wore the same yellow dress Rebecca had bought her last Christmas, one of her mother's previous gifts. The hem was already too short for her growing legs, but Lila refused to wear anything else. Ethan couldn't bring himself to make her. He remembered the last Christmas they'd spent together as a family. Rebecca had baked sugar cookies shaped like stars, laughing when Lila spilled flour everywhere. He could still hear her voice, warm and bright. "One day, Daddy will bake cookies with us too, won't you, Ethan?" Now the penthouse was silent. Family photos lined the walls. Lila in her mother's arms, Ethan with his hand on Rebecca's waist. Frozen memories of joy they couldn't touch anymore. He hated the penthouse sometimes. It felt less like home and more like a museum to a life he couldn't return to. A promise to try. Ethan crouched lower until his face was level with Lila's. He hesitated, gently touching her chin and tilting her face toward him. For a moment, just a heartbeat, their hazel eyes met, and what he saw broke him all over again. It wasn't just sadness. It was emptiness, a hollow, distant look like the world no longer held anything she wanted. "I miss Mommy too, baby girl," he whispered, forcing the words through the lump in his throat. "I miss her every second of every day." His voice cracked, but he kept going. "I don't know how to improve this yet, but we will figure it out together. I promise." A slow blink. Then Lila turned her gaze back to the tablet, shutting him out again. Ethan swallowed hard, pressing his hand over his mouth to steady himself. It felt like trying to pull her out of a locked room where he didn't have the key. The first step out. The rain drummed against the glass, steady and relentless. Ethan stood, running a hand over his face, and made a decision. He couldn't keep hiding in this penthouse, suffocating under silence and grief. "Lila," he said, gently, trying again. "Let's get out of here, just you and me." Her finger paused mid-trace on the chair's leather. That slight hesitation, the tiniest acknowledgement, sent a fragile thread of hope through his chest. "There's a little cafe I've seen on Pine Street," he added, softening his voice as though he were letting her in on a secret. "I heard they have the biggest chocolate chip cookies in Seattle. Bigger than your head, I bet." This time she looked up at him. Just for a second. And in that fleeting moment, Ethan caught something behind her empty stare, the faintest flicker of curiosity. He clung to it like a lifeline. As Ethan helped Lila into her small navy coat, he told himself this outing was just about lunch. But deep down, something heavier pulled at him, an instinct whispering that maybe, just maybe, this small decision would change everything. Tomorrow could wait. The company could wait. The grief could wait. Right now, there was only Lila. And for the first time in months, he felt the tiniest ember of hope warming beneath the weight of his guilt and sorrow. The steady drizzle softened into a mist as Ethan guided Lila out of the penthouse garage and into his black Tesla. The city streets were damp and reflective, catching the gray of the Seattle sky and splintering it into fragments beneath passing headlights. Lila sat silently, buckled into her seat, clutching the tablet like a shield. She didn't look out the window. She didn't look at him. Ethan forced himself to stay calm. He knew by now that words didn't always reach her, but presence did. So he drove without filling the quiet, letting the soft hum of the engine and the sound of rain tapping the roof be enough. His GPS guided him toward Pine Street, where he'd noticed a little cafe once before, but never had the chance to stop. Sweet Haven Café. The name alone sounded like a promise. A place where something warm still existed. A place that wasn't haunted by memories. Today, he needed that. Lila needed that. A doorway of light. The cafe sat between a used bookstore and a vintage clothing shop, its cheerful butter-yellow awning glowing against the gray afternoon. A small sign beside the door read, "Sweet Haven Café, where every voice matters." The words struck him unexpectedly, making his throat tighten. He glanced at Lila, wondering if she noticed them too, but her gaze stayed fixed on the ground. A tiny bell chimed as he opened the door, and a wash of warmth and cinnamon-sweet air greeted them. The space felt alive, but calm wooden tables, scattered in soft patterns, vases holding single sunflowers on each one, and walls lined with local artwork. It was cozy, inviting, the kind of place Rebecca would have adored. For a moment, guilt stabbed him, as if simply being here without her was a betrayal. But he pushed the thought away. He led Lila inside and gently rested a hand on her back, guiding her toward the counter. That was when he saw her. The woman behind the counter. The young woman stood arranging trays of fresh pastries behind the glass display case, her flour-dusted apron streaked with cocoa and flour. She moved with a natural rhythm, almost like a quiet dance, confident, precise, graceful. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her warm brown skin caught the light when she leaned forward to check the labels on a tray of muffins. Her smile arrived first when she turned toward them, radiant, effortless, real. "Hi there," she said, her voice clear but soft. "Welcome to Sweet Haven Café." Ethan glanced up at the name tag, pinned neatly to her apron. Amara Johnson. "Hi," he replied, shifting awkwardly, aware of how stiff his voice sounded. "I'm Ethan, and this is my daughter Lila." Amara's gaze shifted to the little girl half hidden behind Ethan's leg. Her expression softened immediately. "Hi, Lila," she said warmly, raising a hand in a small wave. "I love your yellow dress. It's beautiful." Lila pressed her face against Ethan's coat, clutching tighter to his side. "She's a little shy," Ethan explained, heat rising to his neck. It was easier than explaining the truth. Amara nodded gently, her smile unwavering. "That's okay. Sometimes the world can feel big and loud." Ethan blinked. How she said it, like she understood something deeper, made him pause. A small kindness. "Why don't you two grab a table by the window?" Amara said, gesturing toward an open spot. "I'll bring you some menus." Ethan guided Lila toward the table. She slid into her seat without a word, immediately tracing small, invisible patterns on the wooden surface, the same motion she made everywhere lately, as if carving secrets no one else could read. Within moments, Amara returned carrying 2 menus and a small coloring book with crayons. "I thought Lila might like this while you decide," she said softly. Ethan blinked, momentarily stunned by the thoughtfulness. "Thank you," he said quietly, meaning it more than he expected. She nodded, then turned back toward the counter. And that's when Ethan noticed it. Something different about Amara. Her movements were confident and deliberate, but there was something unusual in how she interacted with customers. She seemed to watch their lips rather than their eyes when they spoke. And when someone across the cafe called out to her, she didn't respond until they waved to catch her attention. The realization settled gently. Amara was deaf. Noticing his gaze, she returned to their table a few minutes later with 2 steaming mugs, 1 hot chocolate, 1 coffee, and a plate holding the largest chocolate chip cookie Ethan had ever seen. "This one," she said, placing the plate in front of Lila with a smile, "is my secret recipe." Lila glanced up briefly, but didn't touch it. Ethan cleared his throat. "Thank you. Do you read lips?" Amara nodded, setting the mugs down carefully. "Most of the time, yes. I lost my hearing when I was 5. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Please don't apologize. It's just part of who I am." Something about the ease in her tone settled him. She wasn't fragile. She was grounded, strong, the language of hands. Then it happened. As Amara adjusted the plate, she began speaking again, but her hands moved too, flowing graceful gestures, fingers tracing invisible paths through the air, each motion deliberate, expressive. Ethan realized with a jolt sign language. And then something in Lila changed for the first time in 6 months. Her small head lifted. Her wide hazel eyes followed the movement of Amara's hands with an intensity Ethan hadn't seen in months. Amara noticed pausing mid-gesture, then smiled softly and signed something simple again while saying it aloud. This, she signed slowly, means hello. Lila's eyes narrowed slightly, studying. Her little fingers twitched on the table. Amara repeated the motion once more, encouraging without pressure. And then clumsy, tentative, but entirely her own. Lila raised her hand and copied the sign. The first spark. Ethan froze, his breath catching hard in his chest. 6 months. 6 months, without a single voluntary word, without a single sign of interest in the world around her. And now here she was, trying. Amara's face lit up, her eyes shining, as she mirrored Lila's small motion back to her. Perfect, she said softly, her hand still shaping the gesture. That's hello. Lila blinked slowly. Then after a moment, she whispered something so faint, Ethan almost missed it. Hello. His throat tightened instantly, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He bit back the tears burning behind his eyes, terrified of shattering the fragile magic of the moment. Amara leaned closer, her voice warm. Hi, Lila, she whispered back. And Lila, Ethan's silent, guarded, broken little girl, nodded the tiniest. Something begins. They didn't stay long after that, but when Ethan helped Lila back into her coat, he noticed her fingers twitching slightly, repeating the simple hello sign, repeatedly, as though memorizing it. As they walked to the car, Ethan glanced down and caught her watching the cafe through the window. There was something different in her eyes for the first time in months. Not joy, not yet, but something close. Curiosity. Ethan didn't know why, but he knew they'd be coming back. And as he glanced at the bright yellow awning one last time, a strange thought crossed his mind, the same whisper he'd felt earlier. This place might change everything. The next morning, the rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, and Seattle's streets were still damp and glistening under a pale, overcast sky. Ethan stood in the kitchen, pouring himself coffee, when he noticed Lila at the table. She held her small tablet in one hand, but wasn't looking at the screen. Instead, she was shaping her fingers slowly, awkwardly, copying the motion Amara had shown her the day before. Hello, she whispered under her breath, the sound barely audible. Ethan froze, gripping the mug so tightly his knuckles went white. It wasn't much, just one word, one gesture. But after 6 months of silence, it was everything. Returning to Sweet Haven. By late afternoon, Ethan and Lila were back at Sweet Haven Café. When they walked in, the warm scent of cinnamon and chocolate washed over them, soft jazz humming faintly beneath the clatter of mugs and quiet conversations. Amara was behind the counter, arranging a tray of scones, her flour-dusted apron streaked with pale smudges of cocoa. She looked up as the doorbell chimed, and her smile widened when she saw them. Back so soon, she sighed, and said simultaneously, walking toward them, with effortless grace. Ethan nodded, smiling faintly. She's been practicing, he admitted, glancing down at Lila. Amara crouched to Lila's level, her warm expression inviting, but never overwhelming. Can I show you another sign today? Lila hesitated for a moment, then gave the slightest nod. Amara signed slowly, shaping her hand into a soft gesture while speaking. This means, thank you. Lila studied her carefully, repeating the movement clumsily at first. Amara's eyes lit up. Perfect, she said softly, her hands shaping the compliment and the words. Ethan watched the exchange, his chest tight with something he couldn't quite name. Relief, gratitude, and somewhere beneath it, the faint stirrings of hope. Amara's story. They sat at a corner table, while Lila carefully traced signs in the air, repeating them to herself. as though memorizing a secret code. Amara joined them briefly during a rush lull, settling across from Ethan with a mug of chamomile tea. "Your daughter is incredible," she said softly, speaking, and signing at once so Ethan could follow. "She's picking this up faster than most adults I've taught." "You teach?" Ethan asked, surprised. Amara nodded. "On Saturdays, I hold sign language classes here, mostly families, parents with deaf children, siblings learning to communicate better. Sweet Haven was always meant to be more than a bakery." Ethan leaned back, studying her. "You built all of this, and you teach too. That's a lot." She smiled faintly. "It had to be. When I was little, there weren't many spaces like this. My parents fought to learn sign language so I wouldn't feel left out. But school was hard." Her gaze drifted briefly toward the window, softening with memory. "Kids can be cruel," she continued. "Teachers thought I wasn't paying attention when I couldn't hear them. Eventually, I decided that if the world wouldn't make room for me, I'd make a space myself." Ethan listened quietly, struck by the steadiness in her voice. There was no trace of self-pity, only quiet strength. "You've built something amazing here," he said finally. Amara's cheeks warmed faintly, though she kept her gaze steady. "Thank you," she signed and spoke simultaneously, her hands shaping the gratitude with quiet elegance. A breakthrough moment. Amara turned back to Lila and signed slowly, "Cookie." She exaggerated the movement to be easy to follow, then mimed breaking a cookie in half. Lila's little brow furrowed in concentration. She repeated the sign twice, until her fingers formed it just right. Amara clapped her hands, softly delighted. "Yes, that's it." Lila's lips curved, not into a full smile, but the faintest upward twitch. Ethan saw it. He'd watched her so closely for months that he noticed even the most minor changes, and it shattered something inside him in the best possible way. Fragile progress. They stayed longer than they'd planned, Lila sitting comfortably at the table while Amara taught her a handful of basic signs. "Hello," "Thank you," "More happy." When they left, Ethan noticed something strange. Lila held the coloring book Amara had given her without prompting. He hadn't seen her willingly carry anything in weeks. As they walked to the car, Lila glanced back at the cafe once, then twice. "You want to come back tomorrow?" Ethan asked softly. She didn't answer, but her tiny nod was all he needed. The days that followed over the next week, Sweet Haven became part of their routine. Every afternoon, Ethan brought Lila after school, and Amara greeted her with a quiet wave and a patient smile each time. Sometimes, she taught Lila new signs. Sometimes, she just let her sit quietly and color while the soft hum of the cafe carried around them. There were no expectations, no pressure somehow that made all the difference. Little by little, Ethan saw Lila returning to the world. She hasn't spoken much yet, but signed now simple phrases and single words, enough to express herself without forcing her voice. And Ethan was learning alongside her, fumbling through each motion clumsily but determinedly. Amara corrected his hand positions gently, her fingers guiding his until they formed the proper shapes. He pretended not to notice her touch's warmth, but his chest tightened every time. Subtle shifts. One afternoon, as Amara showed Lila the sign for happiness, Ethan watched Amara instead. Her hands moved like poetry fluid, expressive, full of unspoken meaning. She wasn't just teaching. She was translating emotion into movement. She caught his gaze briefly, her brow lifting with quiet amusement. "You're not paying attention," she teased gently, signing the words as well. Ethan blinked, flustered. "I am," he lied, repeating the sign awkwardly. Amara laughed, a low, warm sound that settled into his chest like sunlight breaking through clouds. Lila looked between them, her small face unreadable. Then, without warning, she reached out and signed family. Ethan froze, staring at her tiny fingers shaping the word. Amara's gaze softened. She signed it back slowly, matching Lila's motion. Lila looked between them again, then lowered her hands and returned to coloring as if the moment had never happened. Ethan sat there silent, his heart pounding. A quiet realization. That evening, long after he'd tucked Lila into bed, Ethan sat on the penthouse balcony, watching the rain streak the glass railing. For the first time in months, he didn't feel entirely trapped by the silence surrounding him. Something had shifted. Not just for Lila, for him too. Amara wasn't just helping his daughter. She was helping him remember how to breathe again. And that terrified him almost as much as it comforted him. The week after Lila signed her first words passed in a fragile rhythm of quiet victories. Each afternoon, they returned to Sweet Haven Café, and each time Ethan saw a little more life flicker back into his daughter's eyes. But healing wasn't a straight line. On Thursday, everything changed. The setback. That afternoon, Ethan arrived at the cafe with Lila after school. She'd been unusually quiet all day, even for her. Her small hands, usually busy shaping silent patterns, rested stiffly in her lap. Amara greeted them warmly, crouching to Lila's level with her patient smile. "Hi, little star," she signed, gently, shaping the name she'd begun using for her. Lila didn't respond. Amara tried again, slower this time. "Want to learn a new sign today?" Nothing. Ethan carefully touched his daughter's shoulder, crouching beside her. "Sweetheart, it's okay," he whispered. "We're just here to learn. Remember." And then it happened. Small, sudden, and sharp. Lila pulled away from them, tears welling in her wide hazel eyes. Her lower lip trembled, and she pressed her hands over her ears, despite no sound. "No," she mouthed, no voice, just the shape of the word. Ethan's chest constricted. He wanted to scoop her up, shield her, and fix everything instantly, but Amara's gentle hand on his arm stopped him. "Give her space," she whispered, signing the exact words so Lila could see. For several long, aching minutes, they sat in silence. The sounds of the cafe carried faintly in the background. The hum of an espresso machine, muted laughter from a nearby table, soft jazz playing overhead. Finally, Lila lowered her hands and leaned into Ethan's chest, silent tears soaking his shirt. Amara watched them, her expression calm but knowing. "This is normal," she signed softly once Lila's breathing slowed. "Trauma doesn't vanish. Progress isn't a straight line." Ethan swallowed hard, guilt gnawing at the edges of his resolve. "I thought we were past this," he admitted, his voice low. Amara shook her head gently. "You don't get past it," she said. "You carry it differently over time. Today isn't a good day for her." Ethan's guilt. That night, Ethan paced the length of his penthouse living room while Lila slept curled up on the couch, worn out from crying. He stared at the shimmering skyline, his reflection faint in the glass. He couldn't stop thinking about Rebecca. If she were here, she'd know what to do. She'd know what to say, how to reach Lila, how to pull her back from wherever she kept disappearing to. Instead, it was him, and every choice he made felt like fumbling in the dark. For years, his life had been about control, building his company from the ground up, managing thousands of employees, making billion-dollar decisions with absolute confidence. But none of that power, none of that precision, could help him fix his daughter. He closed his eyes, fighting the familiar wave of guilt crashing through him. Maybe if he hadn't been buried in work that night, he would have been with Rebecca. He could have driven her home instead of her taking her car. Perhaps she'd still be alive. The thoughts came like knives, and he couldn't stop them. A voice of reason. Ethan dropped Lila off at school the next day and returned to Sweet Haven alone. Amara was behind the counter kneading dough, and the sleeves of her gray sweater were pushed up to her elbows. She looked up when he walked in, surprise flickering in her eyes. "Where's Lila?" she asked, speaking and signing simultaneously. "At school," Ethan said, sliding onto a bar stool. He hesitated, then exhaled heavily. "Yesterday was hard." Amara wiped her hands on a towel and leaned against the counter, overseeing him. "It scared you?" Ethan nodded, jaw tight. "Every time I think we're moving forward, something pulls her back. I don't know if I'm doing enough." "You are," she said, signing the exact words. "You're here. That matters more than you think." He stared at her for a long moment, letting the quiet weight of her words settle. "You really believe that?" he asked. Amara's expression softened. "I grew up in a world where people didn't have time for me. Teachers gave up when I fell behind. Kids stopped trying to talk to me, and adults assumed I was too much work. Do you know what made the difference?" Ethan shook his head. "My parents." She signed slowly, her hands deliberate. "They stayed. They kept showing up even when I shut them out. That's what Lila needs too. Not a solution. Just you." Amara's burden. Later that afternoon, while Lila colored at their usual table, Ethan stayed at the counter watching Amara work. The cafe had grown busy. A steady stream of customers came in, many chatting in sign language with Amara, as she moved seamlessly between orders and conversations. But in rare, unguarded moments, Ethan noticed something else. A shadow of exhaustion in her movements, the way she paused between tasks and rubbed her wrist, the faint tightness in her shoulders. When the rush quieted, he asked softly, "You okay?" Amara hesitated, then gave a small, weary smile. "Fine," she said, but the way her hands stilled on the countertop betrayed her. "Amara," he pressed gently, "and talk to me." She sighed and leaned back against the espresso machine. "I had a bank meeting this morning," she admitted. "The loan for the bakery expansion isn't going through. They don't think my business model has enough growth potential." Ethan frowned. "What?" "You're always packed in here." She gave a short laugh without humor. "Yeah, but they see a deaf-owned cafe focused on accessibility and assume it's a charity, not a business." His jaw tightened, frustration simmering under his calm. "That's ridiculous." She shrugged, as though used to carrying the weight of dismissal. "It's not new. I've been fighting for people to take me seriously my whole life. I'll figure it out." Ethan didn't miss the flicker of vulnerability beneath her composed tone. A quiet connection. That evening, Ethan and Lila left the cafe later than usual. As he buckled her into the car, he glanced back through the window. Amara was wiping down tables, moving methodically, unaware of his gaze. The cafe was quiet now, the warm lights glowing softly against the encroaching dusk. Ethan sat there for a moment longer before starting the car, for reasons he couldn't fully explain. Something had shifted, not just with Lila, not just within himself, but between him and Amara. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It was a connection. And that terrified him almost as much as it comforted him, foreshadowing the storm. That night, as he tucked Lila into bed, she signed a single word before pulling the blanket up to her chin. Safe. Ethan froze, staring at her small hands, his throat tightening. He signed it back carefully, his own motion awkward but heartfelt. Safe. Lila smiled faintly, then closed her eyes. He sat there for a long time afterwards, watching her sleep, aware of two truths colliding inside him. Lila was healing, and Amara Johnson had become part of that healing in ways he hadn't expected, in ways he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Saturday arrived draped in soft gray clouds, the kind of Seattle morning where the air smelled faintly of rain and fresh earth. Ethan and Lila were already seated at their usual window table in Sweet Haven Café, which overlooked the street. Lila was quietly coloring her little fingers, clutching a crayon as she filled in the petals of a sunflower. Across from her, Ethan sipped his coffee and glanced toward the counter, where Amara arranged trays of muffins fresh from the oven. She moved with practiced ease, her dark hair pulled back into a loose bun, sleeves rolled up as she brushed powdered sugar over warm pastries. Customers greeted her in spoken words and sign language, and she responded seamlessly, shifting between the two worlds as if she belonged entirely to both. Ethan couldn't stop watching her. Lila's brightening world. Amara approached their table carrying a small plate stacked with cookies. She crouched beside Lila and signed slowly, "Want one?" Lila hesitated momentarily before nodding her lips, twitching into the faintest smile. "That's my best batch yet," Amara said warmly, signing the words alongside her speech so Lila could follow. "The secret ingredient is love." Lila bit into the cookie, then sighed somewhat clumsily. "Good." Amara beamed. "Perfect sign," she said, holding her hands up in celebration. Ethan couldn't help it. He smiled too. Moments like this had become small miracles in his day, pieces of light he thought he'd lost forever. But with every step forward for Lila, another truth pressed heavier on his chest. Amara was becoming part of their lives, and that thought both comforted and terrified him. A conversation about Rebecca. Later that afternoon, after the cafe quieted and most customers had left, Amara slid into the seat across from Ethan. Lila was busy at the counter with a small group of other kids Amara had been teaching, practicing simple signs for colors and animals. Amara said, "Lila's doing so well," softly sipping from her mug. "She learns faster every day." Ethan nodded his gaze, following his daughter. "I know. I didn't think we'd get here." Amara studied him for a moment, her expression gentle but searching. "You think about her a lot," she said quietly. Not a question, but an observation. Ethan's throat tightened. "Rebecca," he said, almost whispering her name. It felt strange to hear it out loud after so long. "I do every day." Amara nodded slowly. "You loved her very much." "I still do." Ethan admitted, his voice low and rough. "And sometimes, I feel like letting myself be happy again would mean betraying her." Amara didn't look away. She rested her hands on the table, then signed slowly, deliberately, so he could read each motion. "Grief and love can live together." He frowned slightly, unsure he understood. She smiled faintly and repeated the signs. "You don't stop loving someone just because they're gone. It doesn't have to be one or the other." The words sank into him, like rain on dry ground, quiet and steady. Amara's passed. After a pause, Ethan leaned forward slightly, curiosity pushing past his hesitation. "You mentioned before that people have made things hard for you." How Amara's gaze drifted briefly to the window. "Before Sweet Haven, I worked in a commercial kitchen," she said. "Fast-paced, loud, chaotic. Communication was constant, orders shouted across the room, instructions flying. And I..." She hesitated, exhaling softly. "I got used to being invisible." Ethan frowned. "Invisible." She nodded. "I had to fight to be heard, to be understood. Many people treated me like I was slowing everyone down because I couldn't hear. I'd ask for clarity, and some cooks would roll their eyes. I started doubting myself, wondering if they were right. What made you leave? One day, she said, I realized I didn't want to fight to belong somewhere that didn't want me. So I decided to build my own space. A place where no one would ever feel like their voice spoken or signed didn't matter. Ethan glanced around the cafe, letting his gaze linger on the small vases of sunflowers, the warm yellow awning outside, and the laughter of deaf customers comfortably chatting at a nearby table. You've done exactly that, he said softly. Amara gave a modest shrug, but her smile was genuine. Unexpected honesty. The conversation drifted naturally after that, easy and unforced. But then Amara hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around her mug. Can I tell you something? She asked, her voice quieter now. Of course. Her gaze lowered briefly before meeting his again. I can't have children. The words were steady, but Ethan caught the faintest tremor beneath them, as if she'd rehearsed this confession before. He blinked, surprised, but said nothing at first. It's related to the illness that caused my hearing loss. Amara continued softly. I figured I should say it sooner rather than later. Some people want families, more kids, the whole picture-perfect thing. I've had people walk away when they find out. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. Amara, he said carefully, Lila is my world. I don't want more. I want her to feel safe, to feel loved again. Amara's eyes softened, though she stayed quiet, watching him closely. And for what it's worth, he added gently, you've already given her more than I thought anyone could. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, and she nodded once, as though letting the weight of his words settle. Lila's breakthrough. Just then Lila walked back from the counter, clutching a piece of paper covered in her uneven handwriting. She placed it carefully on the table in front of Ethan. He looked down and froze. On the page, in messy, shaky letters, she had written one sentence. I feel safe here. Ethan swallowed hard, his vision blurring as his chest tightened. Amara leaned closer, reading over his shoulder, and a quiet smile spread across her face. She touched Lila's small hand gently and signed back. Safe. Lila signed it too perfectly this time. For a long moment, the three of them sat there in silence, bound together by something unspoken but undeniable. The crossroads. That night, long after they left the cafe, Ethan sat awake on the edge of his bed, staring at the city lights through the glass. He thought about Rebecca, about the life they'd shared, and about everything he'd lost when she died. But tonight, another image surfaced: Amara at the counter, flower on her cheeks, patient hands guiding Lila's small ones. He felt the guilt rise again, sharp and relentless, whispering that moving forward meant leaving Rebecca behind. And yet somewhere deeper, quieter, another voice spoke. Moving forward didn't mean letting go. It could have meant learning to carry both loves at once. For the first time, he let the thought stay. Saturday morning arrived with unexpected sunshine breaking through Seattle's usual blanket of gray. Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror and caught Lila watching the city roll past, her small hands resting on her lap. She seemed calmer than usual, quietly focused, as though conserving her energy for something important. Big adventure today, Ethan said softly. She didn't reply, but the corners of her lips twitched faintly, and that was enough. The market's rhythm. They met Amara at Pike Place Market, where she was carrying a large canvas bag slung over one shoulder and a reusable coffee cup in the other. She smiled as they approached, sunlight glinting off the tiny gold pendant at her neck. Perfect day for this, she signed, and spoke simultaneously, her movements bright and effortless. Ethan glanced at the colorful chaos stretching around them. Street musicians strumming guitars, vendors calling out prices, stalls overflowing with fruits, flowers, and handmade crafts. The energy buzzed with life. Lila stepped closer to Ethan, her grip tightening on his hand, but Amara crouched to her level and signed gently, safe. Lila hesitated, then nodded once, her shoulders loosening. "First stop?" Amara said, straightening. "You're going to meet my favorite person here, Mrs. Chen's stand." They wove through the crowd until they reached a produce stall, bursting with colors. Crates of bright red apples, golden pears, and leafy greens stacked in neat piles. Behind the stand stood Mrs. Chen, a petite woman in her 60s, with kind eyes and a contagious smile. Amara explained that Mrs. Chen taught me some of my first signs when I started shopping here. As soon as Mrs. Chen spotted them, her face lit up. She signed rapidly, her hands moving like water. Amara laughed softly and signed back with equal speed. Ethan watched, fascinated by the fluid exchange. It looked like a conversation composed entirely of music, quiet but rich with meaning. "What are you talking about?" he asked when they paused. Amara smiled. "She wants to know if this little star likes apples." She crouched to Lila's height and signed the question slowly. Lila observed and then formed the sign for yes. In delight, Mrs. Chen clapped her hands and offered Lila a shiny green apple from a nearby basket. Lila accepted it with a small smile, signing, "Thank you. Clear, precise, perfect." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat, overwhelmed by how far she'd come. Belonging somewhere. New. Amara led them like a guide from stall to stall, weaving through the crowds with practiced ease. People greeted her constantly, vendors, regular customers, and families who had stopped to chat in sign language before moving along. It struck Ethan how beloved she was here. This wasn't just a place she shopped. This was her community. Lila stayed close, but engaged more than he expected. She signed small words Amara had taught her, apple cookie happy, and observed whenever Amara introduced new ones. Ethan noticed something else. Amara always moved at Lila's pace, never rushing her or forcing her to participate if she hesitated. She created space without saying a word, and Lila responded instinctively. He thought of the therapists who had come and gone, the endless appointments, the sterile rooms that only seemed to push Lila deeper into silence. None of it had done what this had, not the experts' money or carefully designed programs. Amara hadn't broken through to Lila by trying to fix her. She'd met her where she was, tension on the edges. They stopped at a spice vendor next where dozens of glass jars held cinnamon, saffron, cardamom, and cloves. Lila inhaled deeply when Amara opened a small tin, her nose wrinkling at the rich scent of cinnamon. "It smells like Christmas." Amara signed for her and then showed Lila the motion for the word. Lila copied it perfectly, a little smile tugging at her lips. Ethan leaned against the wooden counter, watching them with quiet awe, until his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, frowning at the flashing notification board group chat. "Walker, the media is asking questions about your public outings lately. Is Sweet Haven an acquisition target, or is this personal?" Ethan's jaw tightened. Another message came through seconds later. "Investors want reassurance that your priorities haven't shifted. We need you focused." He stared at the screen, the weight of expectation pressing down on him, until Amara touched his arm gently. She asked softly, speaking and signing so Lila wouldn't be left out. Ethan forced a neutral smile. "Yeah, work." But as he slid the phone back into his pocket, he couldn't shake the tension building in his chest. The life he was building here with Amara, with Lila, didn't fit neatly into the box his company wanted him to stay in. And sooner or later, he knew those worlds were going to collide. The honey lesson. Their last stop was a small honey stall near the back of the market. A tall man with a long gray beard stood behind the counter, his weathered hands labeling jars as customers came and went. George Patterson. Amara introduced him warmly, the best honey in the state. George greeted them with a broad smile and offered Lila a wooden spoon dipped in amber honey. She tasted it cautiously, then closed her eyes and sighed happily, making Amara laugh softly. "That one's my favorite," Amara explained, showing Lila the sign for honey. Lila copied it perfectly on the first try. George leaned across the counter toward Ethan. "That's a remarkable woman you've got there," he said quietly. "She's here every Saturday, rain or shine, always caring for everyone else. Don't let her carry it all alone." Ethan nodded faintly, the words landing heavier than he expected. A shared pause. After the market, they stopped at a small cafe overlooking Elliott Bay. The three sat on the outdoor patio, sandwiches spread out on the table, the late morning sun painting everything in gold. Lila sat between them, focused on signing small stories to Amara about apples, honey, and the cinnamon she liked best. Amara followed every gesture with patient enthusiasm, encouraging her to try longer sentences. Ethan leaned back, watching them together, the soft breeze carrying the sound of gulls overhead. For the first time in months, he felt something stir in his chest, something close to peace. He glanced at Amara, catching her mid-laugh, as Lila demonstrated a clumsy but determined sign for sunflower. Her smile reached her eyes. At that moment, Ethan realized how much Amara had woven herself into their lives without trying, foreshadowing change. When they finally returned to the car, Lila climbed into her seat, clutching a small jar of honey and a paper bag of Amara's cookies. As Ethan buckled her in, she whispered so quiet he almost missed it. "Tomorrow." He met her gaze and smiled faintly. "Tomorrow," he promised. As he slid into the driver's seat, he glanced back through the market crowds where Amara was walking toward her car, waving as she went. For the first time, Ethan let the thought settle fully. This wasn't temporary anymore. This Amara Sweet Haven, the quiet transformations happening between them, was becoming home. And that terrified him almost as much as it filled him with hope. Sweet Haven Café had become a second home. By now, Ethan didn't even need to ask if Lila wanted to stop by. Every afternoon, she silently gathered her coloring book and slipped on her jacket, as if it were part of her routine. That Saturday, the cafe was quiet sunlight, filtering through the windows in soft golden streaks. Lila sat at their usual window table coloring, while Amara showed her a new sign. Amara signed this carefully, shaping her hand into a graceful gesture. "Family." Lila's small fingers moved slowly, hesitating, and mirrored the motion almost perfectly. Amara smiled and signed it back again. Ethan watched from his seat across the table, his chest tightening at the word. Family. It was one of the first words Lila had signed without prompting, a brave gesture. After a while, Lila paused her coloring, setting her crayon down carefully. She looked between Ethan and Amara, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then, without warning, she signed again. Family. Us. Ethan's throat constricted instantly. He blinked hard, unsure if he'd read it correctly, but Amara's soft gasp confirmed he had. Amara reached forward slowly, placing her hand gently over Lila's. "Yes," she signed back carefully, her voice low but steady. "Us." Lila smiled faintly, the expression small but mighty, and returned to her drawing as though nothing unusual had happened. Ethan sat there frozen, his hands resting on the table's edge, feeling something shift inside him, subtle but undeniable. This wasn't just about Lila's healing anymore. Something deeper was forming here, something he wasn't sure he was ready to name. Ethan's confession. Later, when Lila joined a small group of kids at the cafe's children's corner, Ethan wandered toward the counter where Amara was stacking clean mugs. He said quietly, leaning against the polished surface, "You're incredible with her." Amara glanced up, brows raised slightly. "Lila's incredible with herself." She signed and spoke, wiping her hands on a towel. " Listen." He hesitated, lowering his voice further. That's not all you're doing. For a moment, her hands stilled. The faintest blush colored her cheeks, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at him steadily, searching his expression. "Ethan," she began, but he shook his head gently. "I know what you're doing for her," he said. "I see it every day. You've given her hope. You've given me hope. And I—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat before he could finish. He wanted to say, "I don't know what I'd do without you," but something about it felt too big, too heavy to drop between them in that quiet moment. Amara studied him, her dark eyes thoughtful, but she didn't press. Instead, she nodded once, letting the silence stretch between them, like a fragile thread neither dared to tug. Amara's walls. A lull settled in the cafe, the low hum of soft music filling the space. Amara sat on a stool behind the counter, sipping her tea, and Ethan joined her, unsure if he wanted the quiet or her company more. "You never ask for help," he said suddenly. She glanced up, surprised. "Help? With what?" "With all of this?" he said, gesturing toward the cafe, the tables, the steady flow of customers. "You run this place practically independently, teach classes, and manage everything. And now I find out the bank turned you down for the expansion loan. You carry all of it alone." Amara shrugged lightly. "I've been carrying myself for a long time." "You shouldn't have to," Ethan said gently, his voice low. Her gaze softened, but her response came carefully, each sign deliberate. "I'm used to standing alone." Something about the firmness in her hands, the weight behind those words, made Ethan hesitate. He wanted to push to tell her she didn't need to do it alone anymore. But he also knew Amara's independence wasn't just a choice, it was a survival skill. So he swallowed the impulse and nodded, caught between two worlds. Later that afternoon, Ethan's phone buzzed again. A new message from the company board lit up the screen. "Investors are requesting clarity. Media speculation is building around your connection to Sweet Haven. Should we prepare a statement?" He stared at the notification, feeling the pull of two worlds, the one he'd built and the one he was slowly stepping into without meaning to. Before, work had always been his safe place. Now, being here in this little cafe, watching Lila's hands move with growing confidence, and hearing Amara's soft laugh that felt like home in a way nothing else did. But he couldn't ignore the storm brewing on the other side of his life forever. Sooner or later, Amara would be pulled into it, whether she wanted to be. A quiet evening. That evening, Ethan offered to drive Amara home after closing. She hesitated, but finally agreed when she saw Lila yawning, clutching her coloring book like a pillow. The drive was quiet, the city lights painting soft streaks across the windshield. Lila had fallen asleep in the back seat, her small face peaceful, her breath steady. Amara traced her fingers along the window frame, watching the blur of passing streetlights. "She's stronger than she knows," she said softly, not looking at him. Ethan nodded, his voice low. "She gets that from her mom." He paused, glancing sideways. "And maybe from you." Amara turned her head, then her expression unreadable in the dim light. For a heartbeat, their eyes held the quiet between them, suddenly charged in a way neither of them could name. Ethan's chest tightened, his thoughts tangled. He was teetering on the edge of something that terrified him, not because it was wrong, but because it felt like hope. And after losing Rebecca, hope felt like betrayal. Lila's question. When they pulled outside Amara's apartment, Ethan carefully unbuckled Lila's seatbelt without waking her. Amara leaned close, her soft voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for today," she said, "for coming with me, for letting me be part of her world." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but a sleepy voice drifted from the back seat before he could. "Amara," Lila mumbled drowsily, her words slurred from exhaustion. Amara turned, smiling softly. "Yes." little star. Lila's eyelids fluttered halfway open. She reached out a tiny hand, curling her fingers in the air, the imperfect shape of the sign for love. Amara's breath caught her eyes shimmering as she signed it back slowly, perfectly. Love. Lila smiled faintly and fell back asleep, her small fingers resting against her chest. Ethan stared at his daughter, his throat tightening until he couldn't speak, choosing the unknown. After. Amara slipped quietly from the car and walked toward her apartment door. Ethan sat there for a long time, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching her disappear into the glow of the building's lights. Every instinct told him to keep his distance, to keep things simple, safe, controlled. But his heart, unsteady and still healing, whispered something else entirely. They were standing at the edge of something neither had planned for, fragile, frightening, and full of possibility. And for the first time since Rebecca's death, Ethan didn't turn away from the unknown. The following week brought a rare streak of early spring sunshine, and Sweet Haven Café buzzed with energy. The warm glow through the windows made the yellow awning outside look even brighter, as though the whole place pulsed with life. Ethan sat at the counter nursing a coffee, while Amara finished teaching her Saturday morning sign language class. Lila sat on the floor, practicing small, deliberate movements with 3 other children. He watched as Lila signed Cookie to another little boy, giggling when he signed more back. Her laughter, quiet but real, rippled through the room and landed in Ethan's chest, like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. This was what healing looked like, he thought. Small moments, fragile but real. Amara's dilemma. After class, Amara returned to the counter, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear as she poured herself tea. Ethan noticed the faint crease in her brow, the kind of shadow she tried to hide when she thought no one was watching. "Bad news again?" he asked quietly. She sighed, setting the teapot down. "The landlord," she admitted. "He's raising rent." "I expected it, but between that and the bank refusing the expansion loan." Her shoulders lifted slightly before falling again. "I don't know how long I can keep Sweet Haven exactly as it is." Ethan frowned, glancing around at the cozy space filled with soft chatter and warm light. It was more than a cafe. It was a sanctuary. For Lila. For Amara. For people who didn't fit anywhere else. "Please tell me what you need," he said. Amara shook her head quickly. "I'm not asking for money, Ethan." "I know," he said calmly. "But what if I could help in another way?" She hesitated, studying him. "What do you mean I have contacts at the bank?" he explained. "And access to business advisors who specialize in small-scale expansions. They're better than most of the suits you've dealt with. I could set up a meeting at least." Amara leaned back, crossing her arms lightly. "And why would they listen to me? Just because you sent them?" "Because," he said carefully, holding her gaze, "I wouldn't just be sending you. I'd be sitting beside you." For a moment, silence stretched between them, charged but unspoken. Finally, Amara exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "I don't want Sweet Haven to become someone else's project, Ethan. This place, it's my fight, and I'm not trying to take it away from you," he said softly. "I want to fight with you." Her eyes softened slightly at that, but she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked past him to where Lila sat, her little hands shaping signs with focus and care. "You're doing all of this for her," Amara said finally. Ethan shook his head gently. "Not just for her," he admitted, his voice quiet. Lila's voice. That afternoon, as they prepared to leave, Lila tugged on Amara's sleeve, her small tablet clutched in her other hand. Amara crouched beside her. "What is it, little star?" she asked, signing as she spoke. Lila tapped the tablet screen, and turned it toward her. On it was a short, handwritten note. "I want to talk more." Amara's lips parted slightly, surprise softening her expression. "Talk more." She signed carefully. Lila nodded her fingers, forming the shape of voice clumsily but intentionally. Ethan knelt beside her, heart pounding. "Sweetheart," he said softly. "Are you saying you want to try talking again?" Lila hesitated, then whispered, barely audible, "Yes." For a moment, no one moved. Then Amara gently reached out, tucking a strand of Lila's hair behind her ear. "Okay," she signed and said softly, "We'll go slow. One sound at a time. No rush." Ethan's throat tightened as he pulled Lila into his arms, holding her close. Her small shoulders trembled, but she didn't pull away. It wasn't a full voice yet. It wasn't perfect. But it was hope, fragile, beautiful hope. Storm clouds gathering. 2 days later, Ethan sat in his office downtown, staring at his phone. A headline splashed across the financial news feed. Walker Enterprises CEO spotted at local cafe, investors question priorities. His assistant had already forwarded 3 emails from board members, all demanding clarification. The media had started framing Sweet Haven as a mystery acquisition target, speculating wildly about potential business angles. Ethan clenched his jaw, scrolling past the noise. He knew what this meant: the life he was rebuilding with Lila, the quiet sanctuary Amara had built, and the pressure of his corporate empire were about to collide. Before he could decide what to do, a new message came through from an unknown number. "Stay away from Johnson. We know what you're doing." He stared at the text, a cold weight settling in his chest. Whoever sent it wasn't from the media. This felt different, closer. A small victory. That evening, he didn't tell Amara about the message. He didn't want to pull her into his world's chaos. Instead, he brought Lila to Sweet Haven as usual. Amara greeted them with a warm smile, seemingly unaware of the storm outside these walls. "Ready for your next lesson, little star?" she asked gently. Lila nodded, her small fingers shaping yes. For the next hour, Amara patiently worked with her on combining words, minor signs, paired with soft sounds, teaching her to bridge the gap between silence and voice. At one point, Lila looked up at Amara and whispered, "Happy." It wasn't perfect. The sound was soft, slightly broken, but it was there. Ethan had to turn away, momentarily hiding the sting in his eyes. Closing time. After locking up the cafe that night, Amara leaned against the doorway, arms folded lightly, as Ethan carried a sleepy Lila to the car. The soft glow of the street lamps painted gold along her hair, and something in the quiet between them felt different. "You're holding something back," she said finally, her voice low. Ethan hesitated, glancing at her. "It isn't very easy." She said gently that you don't have to explain, but her gaze held his. "Just don't shut me out completely." "I'm not," he said softly. "I want to keep this safe. You, her, Sweet Haven." Amara's expression softened at that, and she nodded slowly. Neither of them said more, but as Ethan buckled Lila into the car, he felt the weight of what was coming pressing closer with each passing day. The promise. Driving home, Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror at Lila fast asleep, with her coloring book clutched to her chest. He thought of Sweet Haven, of Amara, of Lila whispering happy for the first time. And in that quiet, he made himself a promise. Whatever storms were coming, the media, the board, the unknown threats, he wouldn't let them take this from her. He wouldn't let them take it from any of them. Sweet Haven had felt untouchable for weeks, a quiet refuge against the chaos outside. But on Tuesday morning, the first crack appeared. Ethan arrived at the cafe early, hoping to grab coffee before a board meeting downtown. As he parked, He noticed a small crowd gathered across the street. Cameras. Reporters. He froze his grip, tightening on the steering wheel. The stories had broken wider overnight. News outlets speculated endlessly about his connection to the cafe, framing it as a secretive acquisition. Some claimed it was a PR stunt. Others implied Amara had manipulated him for business gain. Ethan clenched his jaw as flashes from cameras lit the sidewalk. Sweet Haven wasn't just a sanctuary anymore. It was becoming a headline. Unwelcome attention. Inside. Amara was arranging trays of muffins when he walked in. She glanced up, smiling faintly, but it faltered when she saw his face. "What's wrong?" she asked, signing along instinctively. He hesitated. "The media," he said quietly. "They're outside." Amara's expression hardened, her hands pausing mid-motion. "Why?" "They've connected me to Sweet Haven," he explained. "They think I'm buying the place. Some of them are digging into you." Her jaw tightened. "Into me?" "They've pulled public records," Ethan said. "Your business filings, the denied loan application. Even your hospital records from when you lost your hearing." Amara froze her breath, catching. The tray in her hands wobbled slightly before she steadied it on the counter. "I didn't ask for this," she said softly, her voice shaking just enough to betray her composure. "I know," Ethan said, lowering his voice. "And I'm going to handle it." Protecting Sweet Haven. By midday, the crowd outside doubled. Some customers hesitated at the door. Others turned around entirely. Amara tried to stay calm, smiling and chatting with regulars, as though nothing had changed. But Ethan saw the tension creeping into her movements. "Let me get security," he said quietly, when they crossed paths near the espresso machine. Amara shook her head firmly. "This is a cafe, Ethan, not a fortress. But it's more than that," he said, his voice low but steady. "It's your life's work, and it's Lila's safe place. I won't let anyone turn this into something ugly." Amara just stared at him for a moment, something unreadable in her gaze. Then she nodded just once, conceding without words. Lila's fear. That afternoon, Lila sat at her usual table with her coloring book, but her crayons remained untouched. Her eyes kept darting to the windows where the flashes of cameras broke through the sunlit glass. Amara crouched beside her and signed gently, "Safe." Lila hesitated, then shook her head slightly, her little fingers curling into her lap. Ethan knelt next to her, resting a hand on the table. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "nobody can hurt you here. Not while I'm here. Not while Amara's here." But Lila didn't look convinced. Instead, she turned her coloring book over and buried her face in her arms. Ethan exchanged a glance with Amara, who signed quietly, "Too much noise." He nodded understanding instantly. It wasn't just the cameras, it was everything. Too much attention. Too many unfamiliar faces. Too much change too fast. Breaking point. The tension finally broke when a reporter slipped past a distracted barista and pushed through the cafe, camera raised. "Mr. Walker," she called out loudly, ignoring Amara's attempts to stop her. "Are you personally funding this business? Is this a philanthropic investment? Or—" "Stop," Ethan said sharply, stepping between her and Amara. "Is it true you're romantically involved with Ms. Johnson?" The reporter-pressed voice, rising above the low hum of the cafe. The words hit the room like a stone thrown into still water. A sudden hush fell. Even Lila looked up, her wide eyes locking on Ethan's face. "Get out," he said, his tone quiet but deadly serious. Two staff members rushed over and escorted the reporter outside, but the damage was done. Customers whispered. Some stared. Lila's face crumpled. Amara took a shaky breath, forcing a calm she didn't feel, and crouched beside Lila to sign slowly. "Safe. Here. Always." But Lila didn't respond. She reached for Ethan, clinging tightly to his arm, afraid he might disappear. Amara's walls. Rise. After closing early, the cafe felt eerily quiet, sunlight casting long shadows across the wooden tables. Amara stood by the counter, arms crossed, her expression distant. "This is precisely what I didn't want," she said finally, her voice steady but sharp. "I know," Ethan admitted softly. "I never wanted this for you either." She shook her head. "I built Sweet Haven to be safe. For people like me. For kids like Lila. And now—" Her voice trailed off and she gestured toward the windows where cameras still lingered outside. "I'll fix it," Ethan said. "I'll get them off your back." Amara looked at him, then really looked, her expression unreadable. "And when they don't listen," she asked quietly. "When they keep digging?" Ethan hesitated, searching for the right words, but none came. Amara shook her head slowly. "I can't let you burn your world down trying to save mine." "You're not asking me to," he said, stepping closer. "I'm choosing to." That stopped her momentarily, but the walls around her didn't entirely drop. Instead, she turned away, her hands gripping the counter's edge until her knuckles whitened. A silent plea. That night, after taking Lila home, Ethan stood on the penthouse balcony, the city sprawling beneath him in glittering silence. His phone buzzed endlessly with messages, the board, the investors, the press. But he ignored them all. Behind him, Lila padded out quietly in her pajamas, holding her tablet. She climbed onto his lap without a word and typed a short message, turning the screen toward him. "Will they take Sweet Haven away?" Ethan swallowed hard, pulling her close. "No," he whispered, kissing the top of her head. "I won't let that happen." She rested her small hands against his chest, signing one word, slowly, deliberately. "Promise." He signed it back, his hands steady, even when his heart wasn't promise. Shadows on the horizon. But deep down, Ethan knew promises weren't always enough. Between the media frenzy, investor pressure, and the growing risks circling Amara's business, one thing was clear. The fragile calm they had built was already splintering, and the storm hadn't even hit yet. The storm hit on a Friday morning. Ethan woke to his phone vibrating, non-stop notifications flashing across the screen. Headlines from every major outlet dominated the news. Walker Enterprises under scrutiny. Secret ties to local cafe raise investor concerns. Community hero or corporate takeover. Inside the Sweet Haven controversy. By the time he reached Sweet Haven, a small army of reporters and camera crews had gathered outside. The once quiet street buzzed with noise, shouting questions, flashing bulbs, endless speculation. Inside the cafe was nearly empty. Amara stood behind the counter, arms folded tightly, her shoulders tense. Lila sat at their usual table, clutching her crayons, but not coloring, her eyes fixed on the commotion outside. Ethan crossed the room quickly. "I'll handle this," he said firmly. Amara turned, her jaw set. "Handle it how?" "By drawing more attention. Every time they print your name next to mine, Sweet Haven becomes less mine." Her voice was calm, but Ethan heard the fracture beneath it, frustration laced with fear. Fractures and choices. He exhaled, steadying himself. "I can make this go away," he said. "If I release a statement, if I clarify, the attention shifts." "And what will you tell them?" Amara asked, her eyes steady on his. "Is this all business? That we're just an acquisition?" Her words landed heavier than he expected. Ethan hesitated, opening his mouth, then closing it again. He couldn't lie. Not to her. Silence stretched between them, sharp and unyielding. Amara broke it first, her voice softer this time. I can't let your world swallow this one, Ethan. Sweet Haven exists because people trust it's ours, not owned and not controlled. He looked at her, then really looked, and understood what she was asking. Without saying it, she needed him to protect what she'd built, even if that meant staying out of the spotlight. But the board wouldn't see it that way. Neither would the investors. Every second he stayed silent, their faith in him weakened. Lila's breaking point. The argument ended abruptly when a camera flash from outside reflected across the glass, making Lila flinch violently. Her crayons clattered to the floor as she covered her ears, her entire body trembling. Amara crouched beside her, instantly signing softly, "Safe. Here. Always." Lila didn't respond at first, her breathing shallow and fast. Ethan knelt on her other side, gently taking her small hands in his. "Sweetheart," he whispered, "look at me." Slowly, Lila lifted her tearful gaze. "You're safe," he said firmly, then signed the word with deliberate, steady movements. "Safe." Lila hesitated, then copied the sign shakily. Safe. It was barely there. Imperfect. Fragile. But it was a lifeline. And in that moment, Ethan knew something with absolute clarity. He couldn't let any of this take her sanctuary away. Not the board, not the media, not even his own fear. The public stand. That evening, Ethan stood outside Sweet Haven, facing the flashing cameras and chaotic questions. He raised a hand, silencing the crowd. He said that Sweet Haven isn't for sale, his voice cutting clean through the noise. "I'm not acquiring it. I'm not turning it into a brand. I'm a father whose daughter found hope here. That's the story." Reporters murmured, their angles shifting instantly. "This cafe belongs to Amara Johnson." He continued, his gaze unwavering. "It always has. I've only learned from her and watched my daughter heal because of her work." Someone shouted from the back. "So you're confirming a personal relationship?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'm confirming that my daughter and I trust her. That's all anyone needs to know." Then, without answering another question, he turned and walked back inside. Aftermath. The silence inside the cafe felt like stepping into another world. Amara stood near the counter, her expression unreadable as the muffled chaos outside faded behind the closed door. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes," Ethan replied softly. "I did." They just looked at each other momentarily, the weight of unspoken things hanging between them. Gratitude, relief. Something deeper neither dared to name yet. Then Amara glanced past him to where Lila sat, exhausted, but calmer now, coloring again under the warm lights. "She's stronger than she knows," Amara said softly. Ethan replied that she gets that from the people around her, his gaze steady on her. This time, Amara didn't look away. A new beginning. Over the next few days, the media frenzy began to fade. Ethan's statement made headlines, but the noise slowed without a scandal to feed on. Sweet Haven returned to something resembling normal. And yet, something had changed. Amara stopped keeping as much distance. Lila laughed more freely. And Ethan finally believed that moving forward didn't mean leaving the past behind. But beneath the fragile peace, they all knew this wasn't the end. The board still had questions. Investors still wanted control. And whoever had sent that anonymous warning hadn't revealed themselves yet. The storm wasn't gone, only paused. Closing scene. That night, the three of them sat together at their usual table. Amara sipped tea. Lila focused on tracing letters carefully on her tablet, and Ethan leaned back, watching the warm lights flicker against the cafe's walls. For the first time in months, it felt like they were on the same side of the fight, like they were together. Amara caught his gaze across the table, and for a brief moment, neither of them looked away. Something unspoken passed between them. Not a declaration. Not yet. But a promise. A leap of faith. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something they'd both stopped believing in long ago. Closing scene. That night, the three of them sat together at their usual table. Amara sipped tea. Lila focused on tracing letters carefully on her tablet, and Ethan leaned back watching the warm lights flicker against the cafe's walls. For the first time in months, it felt like they were on the same side of the fight, like they were together. Amara caught his gaze across the table, and for a brief moment neither of them looked away. Something unspoken passed between them. Not a declaration. Not yet, but a promise. A leap of faith. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something they'd both stopped believing in long ago. End of story. Emotional climax. Ethan chooses Sweet Haven and Amara over corporate pressure. Lila's breakthrough. She finds strength in fear and uses her signs as an anchor. Romantic tension peaks. No confession yet, but the connection is undeniable. External conflicts remain. The storm has paused, not ended, setting up the next arc. Join the journey. If you've been following Ethan, Amara, and Lila's story, don't stop here. Comment on what moment it hit you the hardest in this chapter, like if Lila's tiny victories gave you chills. Subscribe to stay with us. The next arc takes their fragile piece and pushes it to the edge.